Let me welcome all of you to this day-long workshop that's jointly organized by the Effective States and Inclusive Development Research Center of the University of Manchester and the Institute of Economic Growth, Delhi. So I'm going to take about 10 to 12 minutes discussing our framework, and then Kunal will come in and talk about what we really do in this book, use this framework to talk about the growth experience in India. So please take a look and so that you can buy it when you look at it. Let's consider 4 facts. During 2003 to 2010, there was a political alliance in power in India, which consisted of 18 parties and a lead party that did not have a majority. Fact number 2, during the same period, a few economic sectors, for example, big construction, telecommunication, mining, including legal and illegal mining, these became very profitable due to high domestic and international demand. Fact 3, these sectors, which were traditionally either government-owned or informal previously, transformed themselves during this period, and we saw that during this period, a few big private firms came up in these sectors. And fact number 4, during the same period, India had its highest average growth rate for any 8-year span in its post-independence history. So is there any connection that you see between these 4 facts? The usual analysis of this period that has been carried out in various journals, academic journals and magazines have not done so. They have not found any connection between these facts. But in our book, we actually see there is a deep connection between these facts. And that's what we really want to point out in this book. The book explains how fact 1, which is basically about politics, and fact 2, which we call rents, I'll explain rents later on, lead to fact 3, which is a few privileged firms, and how all of this lead to fact 4 during that period, which is very high growth rates. More interestingly, we also explain how all these 4 facts played a big role in the political regime change that happened in 2014. And basically, that's something that followed a slowdown in 2010. So in short, our book basically links up politics, rent structure, state-business relationship, and tries to explain the Indian growth experience in terms of these factors. Let me take up the nuts and bolts of our framework. So we have what we call our 2 core variables, the political space and the rent space. I'll explain the rent space later. Then we have something called the intermediary variable, which is basically something that comes out of the interaction between the core variables. So the political space and the rent space, they interact, and that affects what we call the deal space. These will become clearer when we actually talk about India. And finally, the deal space has a critical effect on the outcome variable, which in our framework is growth. And when we talk of growth, we talk of either growth acceleration or a sustenance of high growth or a growth slowdown. These are the basic critical factors in our framework, but we also have something else which is equally important. We have what are called feedback loops. And feedback loops are basically channels that work from growth back to some of the core variables. So the feedback loops can actually affect the the growth rate itself can affect some of the core variables through these feedback loops. Let me now take up each of these variables a little bit with a little bit more detail and explain how we think about it. So in the political space, we think there are 2 very important aspects that play a role in determining growth. The first is the distribution of power. And here we are talking about distribution of power in 2 ways, which we call horizontal and vertical distribution of power. roughly speaking, you can think of it as distribution between political organizations and within political organizations. And the second thing we think that is very important in politics or the political space is the importance of ideas or beliefs or what usually we call ideology. So from time to time we see that the distribution of power plays a more important role, and in other times it is the ideology of the political elites that play a more important role. Next we have the rent space. Before going to the rent space, let me explain a little bit what we mean by rent. In economics, typically rent is meant in a certain way, but in our framework, what we mean by rent is whenever a firm can earn profits that are higher than normal profits, super normal profits, not because they are extremely productive or very efficient, but because government interventions, political interventions allow certain kinds of privileges to these firms, which leads these firms to make these high profits. So that is what we call rent. And we think that corresponding to this idea in the rent space, there are different kinds of firms. So we can have a 2x2 framework here, high rent versus competitive. So that you can have high rent sectors versus competitive sectors, and also export oriented versus domestic sectors. Corresponding to this, we have different kinds of firms. We call them rentiers, magicians, power brokers, workhorses. But the most important thing to understand here is that the state business relationship that we talked about, each of these kinds of firms has a different kind of demand of institutions, of state business relationships, etc. So depending on what kind of rent structure we have in the economy, there will be a corresponding demand for certain kinds of state business relationships. That is the important aspect in our framework. Finally, we have the state business relationship itself. The important aspect in our framework is we think that as opposed to most analysis of state business relationships which focuses on the rules of state business relationship, the laws that govern state business relationship, we think what's important are not those rules or not those laws, but actually what we call deals. And here this diagram explains what we mean. Here you have data from two different World Bank surveys, the Doing Business survey and the Enterprise survey. In the Doing Business survey, you get the number of days by rule that you need to get a permit in a country, a permit for a business. And the Enterprise survey tells you the actual number of days that's needed by firms in that country to get that permit. And if the rules were actually followed, what you would get is that you'd have most of the data points would be on the 45-degree line, which is that the number of days that are needed by firms is exactly equal to the number of days that the law says that's needed by the firm. But what this survey finds is that that's not so. Most firms in most countries actually need far less number of days and work out ways to get this kind of deal, this is what we call a deal, from the political elite of the country. And it's also true that not all firms get the same deal. So we have a situation where the institutional space is defined by deals, and also the deal space itself can be defined in different ways depending on how many firms get those deals. So we define the deal space again in terms of a 2x2. We have an open or a closed deal space and an ordered versus a disordered deal space. Again, all these technical terms will become easier to understand when we talk about the Indian economy. So the open deal space is one where a large number of firms get those deals. It's a bit like a competitive situation. Whereas a closed deal space is one where a few firms, a few big firms are getting those deals. And ordered versus disordered deals are basically when the firms are very sure of the deals over time, that's an ordered deal. But if the deal is there, but you're not sure whether that will be kept, brings in uncertainty in the deal space. That's what we mean by disordered deal space. Finally, we have feedback loops. We have two kinds of feedback loops from growth back to the core variables. These feedback loops are either economic or political. And again, corresponding to each of them, they can be either positive or negative. So I'll take one example to make you understand what that is. Let's take a negative political feedback loop. What does that mean? It means that the nature of the growth is such that it is leading to political changes, political pressures that are challenging the growth rate itself. So that's what a negative feedback loop, political feedback loop is. So the growth itself is leading to changes that is challenging the growth or the nature of the growth. That's a negative political feedback loop. This is just a structure which puts together everything that I have just explained to you. So here we have the political competition, and you have the political ideology and the rent structure, and all of these interact to give rise to various kinds of deal spaces. And what we find is that when you have a credible deal space to a few privileged firms, you suddenly find growth shooting up or a growth boom taking place. But over time, if the credible deals do not go to many firms, the growth boom usually does not sustain itself. So for sustaining, the credible deals have to be transferred to a larger number of firms. So that's what sustains growth. And finally, when you suddenly have the deals starting to lack credibility, that's when you again have a growth slowdown. So the one last point is, basically what we do in this book is basically use this framework and look at 4 episodes of growth in India. The first one is what was traditionally called the Hindu growth episode. In our case, it's 1950 to 92. Then we have 2 growth accelerations, one in 1993 and the other is in 2002. And finally, we have a growth slowdown after 2010. Now Kunal will explain a bit more about how our framework explains these growth episodes. Kunal.
Okay, before I get to the growth episode themselves, I should just say that the way we got these episodes is through using a statistical method, the by-parent method, along with economic filter. Because you could argue, well, why 1993, why not earlier? And clearly, you can always argue about the start of the first acceleration, but we use a particular method of think it's very consistent across different countries, and that gives us this particular episode. But I don't think the argument changes very much if we were to use different ways of looking at the acceleration. So let me just now go to the first episode, and I think this is an episode that's been extensively covered in the literature. So I won't spend, I'm just going to go to the main points. We look at this particular episode, the first episode last in 1992, through the lens of our framework. So in this particular episode, at the beginning we had a very dominant party, the Congress Party, but even in that period we had a very distorted deals environment. There was very little confidence between the government and the business sector. And so the question is that in spite of a dominant political party which was clearly had the credibility and the authority to order deals to the private sector, why did we have a disordered deals environment? And we have 3 arguments for that. The first is pretty obvious. We had a pro-socialist economic ideology of the political elite at that time, with a very strong influence of the Soviet example, which didn't really leave any space for strong state-business relations. Secondly, was the political dominance of the Congress Party really meant that they didn't really need to have resources to fight elections, and therefore they didn't really need to find mechanisms of rent extraction for the private sector. And thirdly, there wasn't really at that time a large rent-thick private sector. So we didn't really have a mining sector at that time, and we didn't have, at that point, a very strong power broker sector. In other words, we didn't really have a strong, non-tradable, domestically oriented sector because there wasn't really very strong. There was very little presence of the private sector in those kind of areas. So there wasn't really much of an interest in the Congress that really offered ordered deals to the private sector. So we had disordered deals pretty much in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and it was not surprising that we didn't really see much growth in that period. Now, what happened onwards was quite a significant set of changes. Political competition comes in, the rent space starts changing, the deal space also changes as a consequence of this change in political space and the rent space, and growth itself starts changing. In the political space, clearly what we see is a situation where Indira Gandhi understands the dominance of the Congress Party was over after 1977. She needs new alliances. and new ways to fight elections, new resources to fight elections. She supports a growing alliance between the political and economic elites and tries to have more collaborative state-business relations, leading to more ordered deals, not completely, but more ordered than before. And so it was a kind of signaling by the state to big domestic capitalists that they were really interested in making sure that they had a fairly ordered deals environment. So that shift happened in the 1980s, which led to a closed, relatively not particularly ordered, but a moving towards ordered deals environment, and also an increase in the share of the power broker sector, particularly in the public sector, which led to some growth. But in our kind of dating of growth episodes, it didn't really count as an acceleration. That happened in 1993. And there, of course, there was much more movement into a more competitive political system. And at the same time, there was a shift in the ideas and beliefs of the political elite towards much more pro-market orientation and a shift towards the private sector. And this happened across the political divide. It didn't really matter which political party, which main political party was in power. At the same time, there was a widening the political connectivity of the Indian economic elites with political elites. New economic players came into the space that we saw from regional economic business groups, and there was clearly a shift of the deals environment towards much more ordered deals environment. Perhaps the biggest source of disorder in the deals environment was the industrial licensing system that was removed in 1991. That automatically led to much more ordered deals environment. And so, the argument we make for this particular episode is that more than economic reforms per se, it was also the ordered deals that were mostly open, but where there were sections which were also quite closed, and there was acceleration of the 1993. And so that was essentially the first growth acceleration. In the second period of acceleration, we saw a different kind of trajectory. First, the political system became much more multipolar with the rise of regional parties. And these regional parties had very strong veto power at the national level, at the regional level, which meant that the political elites had to find ways to strike deals with the larger number of elites, striking deals with economic elites. So that was something that happened in this period. And at the same time, we also saw kind of very clear shift towards much more closed deals. And it was pretty evident that in the way that we had increasingly level of crony capitalist deals, that political elites struck with the economic elites in higher-end natural resource sectors, such as bauxite, coal, iron ore, manganese ore, and so on, both at the national and regional levels. There was something that was driving this whole movement to close order deals, and there were four factors. The first factor was that there was increased demand for minerals originating from China, which meant that the mining sector, the rentier sector became very profitable. There was increasing rents to be extracted from the natural resource sectors. At the same time, there was clear movement to privatization of natural resources, where the state was now allocating licenses for production in the sectors to private firms. So that was the first reason. Second was that in the non-tradable sector, particularly in telecommunications and real estate, with the growth that happened in the previous episode, there was increasing profits to be made in these two sectors, especially telecom, where the state again had the power to allocate resources, and political elites entered into rent-sharing arrangements with business groups particularly in the telecom and the real estate sectors. And third, with the importance of regional governments or regional elites in the coalition governments, we saw increasingly close deals between these elites and powerful economic interests, both at national level and the regional level after 2002. And finally, as elections became much more expensive in the competitive Indian political systems, parties and politicians where there was no access to state financing of elections had to raise funds from businesses informally often in return for discretionary contracts and regulatory favors. So what happened in this particular period, which is the period which we have spent some time analyzing in our book, is that we saw these close order deals coming in, which coincided with the rapid growth acceleration. India had the highest growth rate ever in this particular period, but also, as we document in the book, very clearly there was very limited structural transformation. In fact, we argue there was structural retrogression if you look at data on exports, on production, and so on. There was a move away from the more competitive sectors into the more renting sectors. What happened after that? After that, there were feedback loops now coming in through channels. So essentially, the growth acceleration led to these feedback loops which worked through two channels. The first was the mobilization of non-elites, the middle class, peasants, and so on, against both forced acquisition, for example, of land, and corruption is evident now from the previous growth episode, particularly in the power broker and the rentier sectors. So that was the first pushback, the first negative feedback effect. The second was, of course, that the pushback was also from India's accountability institutions, which are fairly strong by developing country standards. The CAG, the CBI, and the judiciary were the three main accountability institutions that were pushing back against the close order deals. So by the time we get to the 2010-2011 period, we see a situation where the close order deals were no longer sustainable. They were seen as politically delegitimate. And at that point, it was because of the nature of the pushback that happened, we had highly uncertain situation with the deals environment, and the government simply didn't have the authority, particularly with the coalition government that was then at that time, to credibly commit itself to new deals in the face of both challenges from the popular challenges and legal challenges. And deals became increasingly disordered as well. And we show in the book that because of this movement into more disordered deals, investor expectations, measure institutions, and so on, growth itself, investment simply took a hit and growth slowed down. Clearly, it's still not right to call the post-2000 period a growth slowdown as what we saw in the pre-1992 period, but certainly the data suggests a kind of an onset of quite a big downturn in economic growth, which really hasn't recovered since then. So I want to just sort of end with just talking about the part which is not really in the book. So this is the part where I think it's more about the discussion that might happen afterwards. So the one thing that's important in our story is the deals environment. It's a critical institutional arrangement that has played a key role in India's economic growth. Much of the discussion that happens in the media and particularly among economists tends to emphasize reforms of rules, whether it's economic, like the Made in India initiatives, or political, for example, campaign financing or reforming campaign financing of elections. And the problem here is that we are living in a situation where deals are the most important institutional variable. And so if you think about deals as being the most important institutional variable, we've got to think through exactly how we can create incentives for political elites to offer different kinds of deals to different actors, and particularly how to find a political consensus on ordered deals, which after the post-2000 period hasn't really come back on. I mean, the consensus is really not clear on how exactly we can get back to an ordered deals environment. Now, there are certain questions which we haven't really talked about in the book itself. For example, the rise of a dominant party in the post-2014 period. Does that make open order deals more possible? Or we will see a return of the crony capitalism of the early 2000s. Now, it's quite possible it can go either way, and still the evidence on that is not particularly clear. And of course, if there is this move to crony capitalist deals with a strong dominant party in particular segments of the economy, like, for example, in the rentier sectors, of course, I should mention that since 2010, mining has taken a hit partly because of the fact China is no longer a strong source of growth. So mining prices have fallen. So the rentier sector, for example, is not as profitable as it was before. But nevertheless, there's still possibilities of rents in both the power broker and rentier sectors. So there's a question then that are we going to move back to a crony capitalist situation that we had in the 2000s? And also related to that is how strong, and I think this is where we'd like to get some views from the panel, how strong are Indian civil society, accountability, media, institutions to counter the excesses of crony capitalist deals if it was the case that we tend to see more of those kind of deals happening in the near future. And I think the last thing that I think we like to pose is that is there a way to think of a middle ground, a realistic middle ground between closed and open order deals? Because clearly it's not politically possible to think of a world where we have open order deals. Some kind of closed order deals are still very important for political elites to think of, to offer to economic actors. So is there a way to think about a balance between closed and open order deals, and what kind of a political arrangement could that be that allows that to happen?